Welcome to this March International Women's Day edition of the Australia-New Zealand Women's Declaration International. My name is Janet Fraser and I'm a volunteer with the Feminist Legal Clinic in exile. Our principal solicitor, Anna Kerr, is doing tech with Kate Williamson, so thanks to those women. I live and work on Darug and Gundungurra Nurra outside of Sydney. Wherever you're coming from this evening, we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations across this continent. Tonight, we have a huge production and I'm very excited about it. We are ranging across all the articles of the Women's Declaration on Sex-Based Rights to look at the past, present and future of our women's liberation movement. I particularly acknowledge the radical feminists who meet in Meanjin, Brisbane and Naarm, Melbourne every year, facing down the threats and even violence to still speak for women and girls. And now I'm honoured to introduce our panel for this evening. Dr. Jocelynne Scutt is a barrister and human rights lawyer, writer and filmmaker. She has studied, worked and lived in Australia, the United States, Germany, Fiji and the United Kingdom and practiced in all Australian states. She was the first Anti-Discrimination Commissioner for Tasmania and Judge of Appeal, Employment Judge and Chief Judge of the Family Court in Fiji. She is a filmmaker, including The Incredible Woman and A Green Shell Necklace with Karen Baczynski-Lee, among others. Her many books include the Women's Voices, Women's Lives series, 9 volumes, and most recently, Women and Magna Carta, A Treaty for Rights and Wrongs, Women, Law and Culture, Conformity, Contradiction and Conflict, and Beauty, Women's Bodies and the Law. She is currently reducing 200,000 words to 130,000 words for publication of her book on the long struggle for equal pay and pay equity. Stassja Frei lives in Naarm, Melbourne, on land of the Kulin and Boonwurrung nations. She was a staunch feminist in her late teens and early 20s, but without any feminist friends, it was a hard slog. 20 years later, the transgender agenda brought her back to feminism and prompted her to start the Coalition for Biological Reality. The private Facebook group now has over 500 members and the Coalition's public Facebook page has over 5,000 followers. It's a fight she simply can't walk away from. The need for an Australian-focused weekly YouTube show covering the latest gender-critical news was apparent, and after much deliberation, she and Angela Jones started Turf Talk Down Under, which we love and which came live from Brisbane IWD, which was great. Renée Gerlich is a feminist writer based in the Wellington region in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In 2021, she founded Dragon Cloud Press to publish her brief, complete herstory, a history of the world from the Big Bang to neoliberalism from a female-centred perspective. The book is available at dragoncloudpress.com. In 2022, her book Out of the Fog on Feminism, Politics and Coming Alive will be published with Spinifex Press. Dr. Susan Hawthorne lives and works on Juru country in far north Queensland. She joined the women's liberation movement in 1973. She is the author of many lesbian works of fiction, poetry and non-fiction. She has been an aerialist and a Sanskritist, and with Renata Klein co-founded Spinifex Press 31 years ago. She is an adjunct professor at James Cook University, Townsville. And last and definitely not least is Anna Kerr. Anna lives on unceded land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. She is the founder and principal solicitor of the Feminist Legal Clinic Incorporated, which is a community legal service that works exclusively to advance the human rights of women and girls. Her work is largely divided between domestic violence and discrimination cases, and too often this involves defending women from claims made under legislation originally introduced to protect them. She is also the Australian country contact for the Women's Declaration International, and she is the most recent winner of the Eva Bacon Award from IWD Brisbane Meanjin, which was richly deserved. So congratulations from me, a previous winner. We're going to start with the now and then we're going to go to the past, and then we're going to go to a possible future. I'd like to go over to Stassja. She's the inaugural winner of the Magdalene Burns Award this year in Brisbane. So now IWD Brisbane Meanjin give 2 awards to radical feminists. So congratulations, Stassja. What an amazing honour.
On Saturday, 26th of February this year, the Coalition for Biological Reality successfully held our first ever event, Gender Identity in Law. Our wonderful chairperson was Bronwyn Winter, and our speakers were Senator Claire Chandler, Professor Diana Kenny, Ex-Lancic, Associate Professor Holly Lawford-Smith, Professor Patrick Parkinson, and lawyer Catherine Deeves. It was actually not my idea. Isla McGregor's idea was to hold this event, and she specifically wanted Hobart Town Hall. She'd been in contact with a couple of Tasmanian gender critical women, and they initially took the lead in doing the organising. So I really can't take all the credit. It was definitely a team effort. There was a bit to organise: the invitation list, advertising, audio-visual, security guards, and the speakers. Originally, the event was planned for August 2021, but due to COVID travel restrictions, we were forced to postpone. We picked another tentative date for November 2021, but again, the uncertainty caused by COVID, we decided not to risk it and went with February this year instead. The postponement put in motion a number of things. One of the 2 lead organisers pulled out, unfortunately. When planning for the August date, the workload involved in organising this event had affected her performance at work, in her workplace. She wasn't double vaxxed, so at that point she couldn't attend in person. And she was also in the difficult position of having a family member who is trans identified, which meant she couldn't be public about her involvement. So she pulled out, and that meant I had to step up and do a bunch of organising. Also, during this interval, one of our original speakers was Paulie Johnson, who is a man who dresses as a woman, but still goes by he, him pronouns. He cracked the sads with me. We originally involved him as we thought it was important to include a transgender voice so that we wouldn't be accused of transphobia. But the problem with that is, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, is that they're going to accuse you of transphobia no matter how you approach these issues. So if you would want to lead one of these events, you're just going to have to ignore the accusations of transphobia. Don't pay it any attention. Don't delude yourself that you're going to avoid that label. This is a little bit off topic, but I do want to cover it. Paulie Johnson got upset with me because I made a public Facebook post on the Coalition's page. It was a screenshot of a man talking about terrible complications from his sex change surgery. And I just posed the question, are these surgeries ethical? Should they be performed at all, even on adults? And this really upset him. He accused the Coalition of being right-wing conservatives and wanting to take away transgender healthcare. And he wrote a nasty letter to the Mercury newspaper in Tasmania about us, and which thankfully didn't get printed. And then interestingly, on Twitter, he had been complaining about radical feminists weaponizing autogynephilia. So I think from this and the circumstances of his life, he's married with children, that he probably has autogynephilia himself. So that was a real learning experience for me. I can see that Posey Parker, for example, is correct. There is no working with these guys. If they want to start their own transgender critical group, they can. But the result of that whole experience was that I changed the policy of our private Facebook group and removed all the trans identifying people. There are only 4 or 5 of them, so that we don't have to tippy-toe around them anymore. The postponement also gave Hobart City Councillor Jax Fox, a woman who pretends she is without biological sex and identifies as non-binary, it gave her the opportunity to raise the issue at a Hobart City Council meeting where she attempted to have our event cancelled on the grounds that we would be in breach of Tasmanian anti-discrimination law and in breach of council policy. Motion failed. Her and 2 other women, the Lord Mayor and the Deputy Lord Mayor, voted in favour of cancelling us, but the rest of the council, even those that have publicly stated support for transgender rights over the rights of women, they all voted against it. So this gave us media attention in Tasmania. A number of articles ran in the Tasmanian Mercury newspaper, including miraculously an op-ed by Isla McGregor, but also an op-ed by Equality Tasmania's trans-identified female, Charlie Burton. I'd like to say Isla McGregor is a phenomenal campaigner and she knows how to work the media. So after ABC Radio Hobart ran 2 segments, one featuring non-binary woman Jax Fox and another featuring Lord Mayor Anna Reynolds, who is also a Greens Party member from what I hear. Isla phoned the station and demanded a right of reply, and she got me a spot on ABC Radio. The segment was recorded, not live to air, and I went into detail about autogynephilia and made it clear that our position on women's sports is the majority opinion based on the polling undertaken by the organisation Binary Australia. This information was edited out of the interview. Surprise, surprise. I'm pretty sure this was, however, a first for Australia to get a gender critical voice onto the ABC anywhere in the country. About 1 month prior to the event, our security firm, who were meant to provide 4 security guards on the day, pulled out. They had been threatened by their major client, who made up around 90% of their work, that if they worked at our event, he would drop them as contractors. That's corporate blackmail. So his suspicion was that one of his employees has a trans-identified child, and that employee must have contacted his major client, tipped him off, and in turn threatened this guy's livelihood. So at this point, we were aware that Charlie Burton of Equality Tasmania was organising a protest, so we really needed security guards. Thankfully, a lovely couple from Hobart got involved in helping us organise the event. I think they were quite recently had reached peak trans. The husband in that couple had experience working as a security guard, and he started liaising with Hobart Police, who weren't much help, liaising with town hall staff. He made a few trips to the town hall to get the lay of the land and sort of work out where the protesters might cause problems for us. The wife in that couple called around to virtually every single security firm in Hobart. I think it was 13 in total. They were all declining the job. So we suspect that there may have been some shady McCarthy-style blacklisting going on behind the scenes. Eventually, thank God, she found a firm in Launceston, which is 3 hours away from Hobart, and they agreed to do the job. So I arrived in Hobart about a week prior to the event, and Isla McGregor put me to work. One of the days we drove around Hobart for about 5 hours, I reckon, hand delivering invitations to all sorts of prominent people. We did 3 media releases that week. It just so happened that the same week I was there, so was Scott Morrison, and he had just announced that he was in support of Senator Claire Chandler's Save Women's Sports bill. So that required a media release as well. We sent out more email invitations. I was getting last minute bookings for the event, which required a bit of admin work. I did the tickets manually. I'm glad I did it that way because we did get some ugly attempts to book out all the tickets from trans activists. The funniest of those fake bookings was from an email address, which was, "You TERF assholes, you are not feminists, just bigots," at hotmail.com. And they tried to book 666, ooh, a scary number, tickets. So if we had used Eventbrite or one of those sort of platforms, I wouldn't have had control over who was booking. So it was a bit of work, but I'm glad we did it that way. On the day of the event, I was very nervous. My major concern was that we would get like 20 people show up. That wasn't the case. Our security volunteer did a head count and there were about 80 attendees. The transgender protesters initially congregated across the road in a city garden square. The Tasmanian media reported that there were 200 of them, whereas our security guy counted about 120. Another thing Isla and I had done during the week in the lead up was design and get printed some very large signs saying the time for no debate is over and transgender laws discriminate against girls and women. We had a number of volunteers out the front of the town hall holding these and other signs. To our aggravation, 2 transgender flags were flying out the front of the town hall. One of our volunteers sort of asked the employee of Hobart City Council who was working the event, you know, how did this come about? And he revealed it was the Lord Mayor, Anna Reynolds, who had given the order that morning. Isla McGregor has followed this up at a council meeting and the mayor has denied that it was her. So we're still following up on that. I'll be demanding our money back for the hall hire, see how we go. Things were calm to speak with, to start with, sorry. Our speakers, Bronwyn, Claire, Holly and Kath, met at a coffee shop down the road and all arrived together. They were expecting a mob of trans protesters there on the city hall, town hall steps, but they hadn't moved over from the garden square yet. And when Holly saw me, she walked over and gave me a big hug, which was awesome because I was really nervous at that point. And eventually the protesters did move over to their town hall. And look, I missed a lot of that action. I was running around doing other stuff, but they had 2 TV crews filming them and their concerns, while our press conference attracted 1 junior SBS reporter who was really only interested in Claire Chandler's Save Women's Sports bill. The protesters were instructed to stay off the steps. They didn't comply. I believe our security guards got involved and sort of pushed them back. One of our volunteers described how they backed up 1 step at a time in an attempt to cover our signs with their signs. And she said the idiot standing in front of her was holding a makeshift sign that was on the back of an Amazon delivery box. And this person had left the delivery address sticker on the box. So our protester, Sonia, her and her friend just started reading out the name and address over and over of where this guy lives. And he's just slowly taken his sign down. When the announcement was made that the event was starting, the protesters surged to try and get into the building. Our security pushed them back. A Hobart City councillor tried to barge his way through, claiming that he had a right to be there because he's a councillor, but he wasn't on the door list. He became really unhinged about being denied entry, but, you know, really we just wanted to know we didn't know he was a councillor. We wanted to know who he was and why hadn't he booked a ticket. And then he threatened our security guards and said their company would never work a Hobart City Council event ever again, and just drama. The event itself went well. There were about 5 transgender supporters in the audience, but none of them caused any problems. We had 3 speakers presenting in person and 3 presenting by Zoom. I wouldn't do it that way again. There were serious technical issues with Exelantic's connection, so that wasted about 10 minutes. And then when she had to give up on sharing her slides. And then her audio was terrible. I couldn't understand a word of what she was saying. So that was a bit embarrassing, but the uploaded recording is fine. If anyone wants to watch it, you can hear her clearly. Senator Claire Chandler was our keynote speaker. She told me quietly that she thought her toughest week in politics was tabling that women's sports bill. But then when Morrison announced his support for the bill, it had been a week of difficult interviews and media giving her a hard time, downplaying the importance of the bill. But she got quite the almost standing ovation. The audience clapped and cheered for her for quite some time. So I think being in a room of supporters really made up for her having had a terrible week that week. Diana Kenny spoke on rapid onset gender dysphoria and social contagion via Zoom. We had invited American woman Exelantic to speak as a desister, but she only briefly touched upon that and then moved on to her theories around gender identity as a modern religion. Holly Lawford-Smith spoke on gender identity propaganda, and that was quite entertaining, got a few laughs. Patrick Parkinson spoke via Zoom on the implications of gay conversion therapy laws, and also that also ban so-called gender identity conversion therapy. There are a few issues with his connection as well, which is disappointing. And Kath Deeves of Save Women's Sport Australasia spoke, of course, on women's sports. So I would do a few things differently if we were to do this over. I've certainly learnt from running this event. All up, I'm quite proud that we pulled it off and attracted 80 people. We spent roughly 3,000 all up, and I'd like to thank anyone watching that donated to that, including a certain major donor that put in $1,000, which was fantastic. So it would be great to be able to repeat this in every major city around Australia. So I'd just like to put the call out if anyone would like to take the lead in your state, please get in touch. Thank you.
And now I'd like to turn over to Anna Kerr. Thanks, Anna.
I've been asked to speak about feminism today, and I'm going to be talking about how I think they're under siege. But there's signs that you've probably all seen before, same shit, different century. I think that's pretty relevant, really. That's really what's going on. And I mean, I don't think feminism is under siege for the first time, but certainly it does feel like we're under siege at the moment. I think what's happening is we're going through a period of ferocious pushback. Feminists seem to have made some very substantial gains in the 20th century, and men are working very hard to undermine these advances. When it comes to maintaining power over women, men are more determined and highly organised, far more highly organised than women realise. And I think women's tendency to underestimate men in this regard is a bit dangerous, both on a micro level, as I see in my domestic violence work, but also on a macro level, which is what I'd like to focus on today. This is probably a bit bleak, this presentation. I've just been writing it today, and I'm going to be focusing on what they're doing. I've got some slides with pictures of them, and I was just looking at it thinking, really, I should have pictures of women like ourselves to celebrate feminism, but it's not. I'm afraid that I was focused more on what they're doing. So there's no doubt that the 1970s were a heyday for feminists, with women making strides toward attaining sexual and reproductive autonomy, equal pay, and better conditions in the workforce, and establishing women's refuges and laws to tackle domestic violence. We also had the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, being adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1979. However, back then, men were busy planning a means of dismantling all that had been achieved. And one of their most heinous plans, to my mind, was to achieve this by taking control of the feminist narrative and turning it on its head by undermining the very definition of woman. So some of the key players in these machinations include Martine Rothblatt, who is a lawyer and entrepreneur and currently a top earning CEO in the biopharmaceutical industry, thanks to people like Billick for her work in tracing some of this. He identifies not only as a trans woman, but also as a transhumanist. Rothblatt worked with Phyllis Frei, a transsexual lawyer from Texas who was ex-army and went on to become the first transgender judge in the world. I've got a slide with some of these characters on it, so you can look at that while I talk about it. So Frei contacted then Stephen Whittle, a trans-identifying female in the United Kingdom, and at that stage, president of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH, which those of you who are concerned about what's happening with children would be familiar with that organisation. Anyhow, together with some others, they put things in motion, with the result being the Yogyakarta Principles, which were signed by a group of about 30 people in 2006, and were later extended in 2017 with the notorious +10 demands. So the drafting was apparently led by Irish human rights lawyer Michael O'Flaherty, who was a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee at the time, and also an ordained priest. So while feminists were busy chanting, not the church, not the state, women will decide our fate, men within the church and the state were doing their best to ensure our demands would fall on deaf ears well into the future. Because although the Yogyakarta Principles have never been accepted by the United Nations General Assembly, they have still been successfully used as a device to manipulate the international human rights agenda and also domestic legislation in many countries, including Australia. Indeed, the Australian Human Rights Commission cites these principles on its website, stating, "The Yogyakarta Principles are not legally binding themselves, but are persuasive in shaping our understanding of how human rights obligations apply and relate to people of all sexual orientations and gender identities." Personally, I don't find them persuasive, but no doubt this understanding paved the way for the 2013 amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act that introduced provisions to protect gender identity, thus creating a potential conflict with the original provisions of the Sex Discrimination Act. Perhaps one reason the Commission considered the Yogyakarta Principles so persuasive is that among the organisers and signatories were some key Australians, including Elizabeth Evatt, who was the first Chief Justice of the Australian Family Court, international human rights lawyer Philip Alston, whose brother was an Australian federal politician and then the High Commissioner of the United Kingdom, and Chris Sidoti, who was the founding secretary of the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, which was the precursor to the Australian Human Rights Commission. So considering there were only about 30 signatories all up, it seems to me that Australia was extremely well represented. So psychological studies in the 20th century established that people are heavily subject to both the influence of authority figures and also the need to conform with others in their group. So the famous Milgram experiment pictured here demonstrated that the majority of people would even administer a potentially fatal electric shock when instructed to do so by a man in a lab coat. And meanwhile, the Ash conformity experiment showed how people will suspend their own judgment and ignore the evidence of their senses, rather than put themselves at odds with the rest of a group. These findings, I think, for me, explain how it's possible in a very short time to have our society embrace the mantra, trans women are women. The combination of authority and also not wanting to, speak out and differentiate yourself from the rest of the group. So with the advent of the internet and the increasing concentration of global media control in the hands of a powerful few, it has just been far too easy. Astroturfing has been used extensively to make it appear as if this well-orchestrated control of the mainstream narrative is simply the result of a grassroots movement. Organisations like Stonewall in the UK and ACON here in Australia are conduits for the release of propaganda to government, private corporations, media, and community organisations, including the women's sector. So all of this lays the groundwork for legislative changes, including laws that enable the change of sex on birth certificates, the introduction of discrimination provisions that protect gender identity, and most recently, laws that ban health professionals and others from discouraging the use of hormones and surgeries on youth and vulnerable people who want to change sex or have been led to believe that they can through medical interventions. So we've got different elements of that legislation in every state and territory in Australia now. And New South Wales, where a lot of it started, is now apparently there's an omnibus bill which is going to further increase the nature of that legislation. So, for instance, in New South Wales, we're one of the remaining states where sexual affirmation surgery is still required to change your birth certificate, but there's a bill already in the pipeline which will probably wind that back and make it like the other states where self-declaration is enough to change your birth certificate. So you could be thinking of this as it sounds a bit like a war, and indeed a great number of our opponents have military training. According to some studies, over 20% of all transgender adults in the United States have served in the military, in comparison with only 10% of the general population. And despite a ban on transgender military service, transgender survey respondents have served in the military at nearly twice the rate as people in the United States population overall. Other studies put the figures even higher, with gender identity issues within the military occurring at 5 times the rate of the general population. So perhaps this might make some sense for females who are claiming a male gender identity, but it's more difficult to explain the very high numbers of males claiming a female identity while also aspiring to be a soldier. This is often explained as some kind of overcompensation, but frankly, I think this is hardly convincing. And this, I'll just give you another slide. So back to, these are some of the characters in Australia. So as you'll see from that slide, a lot of the individuals there have military backgrounds, and here are just a few of the ones in Australia. I haven't had enough time, unfortunately, to work on this, but I think you'll find that it's a very familiar thing when you're reading about somebody with a transgender profile that they also do have a military background. And so in Australia, for instance, Kate McGregor, who was a senior ranking army officer, was one of the first transgender people to garner widespread media attention, and with the support of Conservative leader Tony Abbott, Kate McGregor quickly became a household name. Other activists litigating against our clients have military backgrounds, including Bridget Clinch, who brought a vilification claim against Beth Rett. I also note that the Australian Defence Force was a founding member of ACON's Pride and Diversity program. And considering the extensive funding being pumped by United States billionaire Jennifer Pritzker into nurturing transgenderism within the military, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to wonder if all this is just a coincidence or an official strategy to use the force of the state to advance the transgender agenda. Aside from bringing vast resourcing and military training to the task, men also benefit from an army of handmaidens helping them. It is much to be regretted that so many women devote both their personal and professional lives to propping up aggressive masculinity. Just as it's often a struggle to convince women to leave abusive partners, so it is to convince them to stop servicing the patriarchy. Women are trapped not only by financial constraints and familial and cultural obligations, but also because they've often internalized their oppressor's narrative. So the challenge is yet again how to gain control of the narrative. How do we change this when our media is so controlled? Anyhow, the good news is that this, what I think is really an increasingly full-scale assault on women, is slowly beginning to wake some women up. And so alongside the fake feminism that's dominating mainstream media, we're also seeing a revival of the real thing, which is taking the form of a partially underground movement consisting of women like ourselves. Unfortunately, feminists today are increasingly fearful and shy of speaking up, which demonstrates the extent to which men are waging a battle against us. Even the current African-American woman who's just been nominated to the United States Supreme Court lacks the confidence to even say what a woman is, let alone defend their rights, responding instead that she is not a biologist. With women being disciplined, sacked, censored, and otherwise silenced, feminists today are effectively gagged and bound by the pronoun police. However, if this is a war, I would say that for too many women, the family court is the front line. It's here that women are bogged down in the trenches and are suffering some of the greatest losses financially and emotionally during drawn-out litigation over many years. It is here that women are often robbed of any financial security and they're exposed to extreme psychological and abuse. And worst of all, it is here that they have their children removed from them by force. Women who raise complaints of domestic violence and child abuse against the fathers of their children are treated most brutally. Once accused of engaging in parental alienation, they're likely to have their children placed for increased time with the perpetrator of violence. Recent research conducted by Nola Webb and a team of others was released last year and demonstrated that women who make allegations against men in respect to child abuse are believed only 17% of the time, and in most other cases are heavily penalised for sharing their concerns with the court. It concerns me often that the transgender debate distracts us from the work that we need to do to support the women in the family court jurisdiction. It's also in the family court that we see the Hague Convention on Child Abduction used to prevent women and children from escaping violent perpetrators. And meanwhile, in our local court system, the protection promised by our domestic violence laws continues to be evasive as women struggle to be taken seriously by the police and magistrates and are increasingly having to instead defend themselves from proceedings being brought at the behest of a violent man. Sadly, legislation that was introduced with the intention of protecting women and children is increasingly weaponised against them, and we are seeing a steep rise in the number of women being incarcerated, particularly within the Indigenous community. Of course, the combination of these different factors, I mean, we've now got the spectre of more men being accommodated in women's jails. We are also losing a lot of our services and safe spaces, such as women's refuges, are all under threat as a result of the of gender ideology. I should also mention that it's the family court that rubber stamps surrogacy arrangements made overseas and which fails generally to recognise the importance of the unique nature of the attachment between a mother and child. It seems that in the name of equality, women have traded off far too much for far too little in return. We've allowed men to place a price on those things which are priceless. We've allowed ourselves and our children to be commodified. Feminism today is not only, well, when I say we've allowed it, that's unfair to women because we've had it inflicted on us, but I do think that we need to be protesting more loudly. And unfortunately, many feminists are instead adopting that narrative as one of empowerment rather than saying that things like prostitution and surrogacy are in fact exploitative and harmful to women and children. Feminism today is not only failing to keep women and children safe, but too often it is being co-opted and used against women to inflict further harm on them.
I would like to invite Jocelynne Scutt to speak. Over to you, Jocelynne.
I'd actually like to begin at the end by referring to the words of Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was appointed, when she took her place on the Supreme Court of the United States. And what she said was this: I would not be in this room today without the determined efforts of women and men who kept dreams of equal citizenship alive in days when few would listen. People like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Harriet Tubman come to mind. I stand on the shoulders of those brave people. We in Australia could recite names too. Truganini, much more recently, Gibbs, Paula Gibbs. Also, we have, of course, Vida Goldstein, Mary Lee, Catherine Susanna Pritchard. We could go on and on. And every single one of us in this room today, every single one of us in this world today, stand on the shoulders of the brave women who went before. And one of the aspects of the women's movement of the 1970s, which was not the second wave, there's never been waves of the women's movement, because women have agitated, women have campaigned, women have women's rights consistently through the ages. And this narrative of wave is simply wrong. It's as if there's a wave and then there's a recession. There's never a recession of what we do or what women have done or how women fight and how women struggle. So we need to get rid of that language, and I'll come to language. But we need to remember our history, and that Australia was the first country in the world to give for women to win the right to vote. Now, sadly, it did not extend to Indigenous Australian women, and we stand properly reviled for that. But we won that right. Finland actually claims it because Australia is simply written off the map, and our activity, our actions, our campaign needs to be recognised, our campaigning skills. This is on the screen is the banner that women from this country sent to the United Kingdom to say, we've won the vote here, we've won the vote. You too can win the vote in the United Kingdom, and all will be well, or even better best. Vida Goldstein stood up for the rights of women. She was the first woman in what was the British Empire to stand for Parliament. She stood to the Senate in 1903 when women could first stand federally. In South Australia, of course, they won it in 1894. But Vida Goldstein, the statement on the screen could be read in ways that could be derided, because she talks about moral values, she talks about a world crusade, she talks about spiritual humanity. And these words, of course, have been appropriated in different ways to misrepresent what Vida Goldstein meant. Vida Goldstein meant we have an ethical position, and it's an ethical position, a moral position for which we fight and we campaign. That is our crusade. Susan B. Anthony said, failure is impossible. And when I first came into the women's movement, all of us believed that failure was impossible. We believed we would actually change the world. We fortunately had historians amongst us who seem to be absent at the present time from the present engagement in terms of women's campaigning. And we therefore knew that we were not the first. We were the first in the sense of the many, many, many who had come before us, one of them, Susan B. Anthony, the United States suffragist. Robin Morgan coined the term, the phrase, the personal is political. And we, in the 20th century, and we too have recognised in turn that the political is personal. Women like Lee Rhiannon recognised that we were not the first, that we were standing on the shoulders of the women who'd gone before us. Her mother, Freda Brown, had been active in the women's movement long before Lee was even born, and Lee Rhiannon continued her activism. We had 6 demands, and let me come to the words of Joyce Stephens, that wonderful, strong Australian feminist. Why are we women's liberationists? Because women's work is never done and is underpaid or boring or repetitious, and we're the first to get the sack, and what we look like is more important than what we do. And if we are raped, it's our own fault. And if we are bashed, we must have provoked it. And if we raise our voices, we're nagging bitches. And if we enjoy sex, we're nymphomaniacs. And if we don't, we're frigid. And if we love women, it's because we can't get a real man. And if we ask our doctors too many questions, it's because we're neurotic and or pushy. And if we expect community care for our children, we're selfish. And if we stand up for our rights, we're aggressive and unfeminine. And if we don't, we're typical weak females. And if we want to get married, we're out to trap a man. And if we don't, we're unnatural. And because we still can't get an adequate, safe contraceptive, but men can walk on the moon. And if we can't cope or don't want a pregnancy, we're made to feel guilty about it. And for lots and lots of other reasons, we are part of the women's liberation movement. I pay tribute to the wonderful Joyce Stephens for that, which appears now on, well, we hope it's still appearing now on posters, the women's liberation movement. We fought for equal pay, standing on the shoulders of women before. My book, Wage Rage, will point this out. From at least the end of the 19th century, my book goes back to the end of the 19th century and right up to now. My mind, my body, my choice, and my right to engage in education in order to advance my own rights, my personal rights for which we have to stand up, and the rights of all other women. The issues for which we fought are still on the table. Take, for example, rape and sexual offences law. In 1977, the Women's Electoral Lobby drafted the Rape and Other Sexual Offences Bill. In that bill, drafted by myself, Di Graham, a wonderful campaigner. We began campaigning when she was 60 and I was 28. And Kerry Hubel, who another wonderful campaigner, the first executive officer of the Women's Advisory Council, established by Neville Wran, the Premier at the time of New South Wales, a wonderful contributor to the rights of women. And in this draft bill, the Well Draft Bill, one of the provisions was, this is 1977, that judges must be educated and the barristers who work in the field. And this, it's not enough to an implication, it must be in the law. Well, it's taken 40 years. Last year, Canada put very provision into their own sexual offences law. When I actually put this proposition at a seminar in the Wentworth Hotel in Sydney, I was accompanied on the stage by a number of people, one of whom a woman, I shan't name her, but I could, who actually rebounded against what I'd said and said that this was wrong to say that judges should be educated. I believe she actually hopefully has changed her position. Women's rights, women's refuge, the fact that women had to leave their own homes with their children and be homeless, and the women who set up Elsie Women's Refuge in 1973, we pay tribute to them because they did change the world. Even homes, violence in the family, that was a real issue for us in the 1970s and the 1980s. Another issue which we addressed and where we were vilified and continue to be so was in relation to the sexual violence against women, which is embodied in the exploitation of women through the pornography industry. And that was a huge issue. And in that, we were actually replicating, in a sense, the work of those women at the end of the 19th century who fought to have the right women to engage in sexual activity fully and freely, not under any control. They recognized that prostituted women were exploited women, and they were vilified, just as we are vilified today when we say that we want women's rights to have proper jobs, proper incomes, and not to be reliant on being exploited by men through the industry, the prostitution, the exploitation of women, or the pornography industry. There were many recognitions amongst feminists that there were different positions: socialist feminists, radical feminists, revolutionary feminists, and there were the women who continued the aim of peace. We wanted peace. These are the women at Pine Gap in South Australia, demonstrating against the United States invasion of Australia through these so-called defence facilities, where they actually think they own our land. And when the Whitlam government attempted to discover what was going on at Pine Gap, they got into trouble. We also recognise the way that women became engaged with the women's movement. In 1978, there was a fantastic, wonderful conference at Macquarie University. The principal organisers, Sabina Erica and Suzanne Bellamy. Suzanne Bellamy, that wonderful artist, and Sabina Erica, the wonderful writer. We had the most fantastic conferences and seminars. We also, of course, had ovulars. Women recognised that a seminar is not really what women do. When we engage in discussion and debate with each other, we are engaging in ovular activity. We were speaking out. We spoke about language. We spoke about the fact that words matter. My book, Singular Women, Reclaiming Sisterhood, was saying spinsters were powerful, wonderful women. They were engaged in the spinning industry, and they demonstrated time and time again when men had their wives up for sale at markets, and they would descend on the sale and the market. Women's voices must be heard, and the silences must be broken. This means that not only women have a right to speak, but we have a right to be listened to, and we must be. The issue about silencing is twofold. We can be silenced because we don't speak, and there's never been a time when women do not speak. But we can also be silenced because we are not listened to, we are not heard. We all know the experience around the conference table when we say something or a woman says something extraordinarily intelligent and a real contribution to the discussion. And then everybody ignores it until a man repeats precisely the same thing and is lauded for it. In these circumstances, we must always come back to what the other woman said and say, as Julie Smith said, as Rhonda Jones said, as Pearl Gibbs said, we need to affirm that what women say matters and must be acknowledged. But feminism does not mean that everything is okay. Principles are important and central to what we as women have a right to demand of ourselves as well as of the world. It's not wrong for us to say that we do demand that women adhere to a feminist ethic. We are still agitating here in the 2000s, and of course it's interesting to be seen as the old women of the movement. We need to engage with women, law and culture, conformity, contradiction and conflict, recognising that every single culture, it doesn't matter what it is infused with patriarchy, has come from patriarchy. They took over from what women have established, and that is what they are doing now. They are doing it through the notion that we should go into a doctor's surgery, we should go into so-called cosmetic surgeons, we should go into so-called aesthetic surgeons and have our bodies chopped about. There is no part of a woman's body now that is safe from the surgeon's knife. We can talk about female genital mutilation, but it's going on within our own Western culture in terms of women having their genitals actually so-called consenting to be changed in some way to make them look more respectable or aesthetic. One really wonders what the motivation is behind this. Of course, it's money, and it's the suppression and oppression of women. In 2022, we held a women's parliament, again on the shoulders of the women of the past, who in this country ran women's parliaments to gain the vote. At this women's parliament, we had a motion to say that CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, signed by this country, the United Kingdom, in 1981, ratified by this country, the United Kingdom, in 1986, after Australia, of course, has never domesticated that convention, and we are demanding a Women's Bill of Rights. Protest to be effected must be followed by resolute action, and this is what we are engaged in and what we engage in still. We have not given up. And I conclude on these words of Adrian Rich. If I could have one wish for my own sons, it is that they should have the courage of women. I mean by this something very concrete and precise. The courage I have seen in women who, in their private and public lives, both in the interior world of their dreaming, thinking and creating, and the outer world of patriarchy, are taking greater and greater risks, both psychic and physical, in the evolution of a new vision. Victory is conceivable. Courage has its own momentum. In the words of Millicent Garrett Fawcett, courage calls to courage everywhere, and its voice cannot be denied. Our voice will not be denied.
And now, to continue in this magnificent vein, I would like to introduce Susan Hawthorne. Over to you, Susan.
Truly fabulous to be part of this panel, and I'm really delighted to be here and speaking from Jiru country in far north Queensland. I grew up on Wiradjuri country in 1950s rural Australia on 2 farms in the Riverina. I joined the women's liberation movement in 1973 and came out as a lesbian in 1974. I volunteered really quickly at Melbourne Rape Crisis Centre and the Women's Liberation Centre, and also for a time at Halfway House. After attending Teachers College, I eventually got to La Trobe University, where I studied philosophy, history and zoology. Philosophy became my main subject, but I studied in history wonderful subjects called revolutionary history, Mexico, Russia and China, African history. There I was especially interested in the Igbo women of Nigeria, who raised a war called the Women's War in 1929 using pots and pans. And women's history, British and Australian, and especially around issues of suffrage. My first public writing activism as a feminist was putting up graffiti. There was a cigarette called Bradfield, which had the line "not mild," and groups of us went around Melbourne adding "but sexist" underneath it. And the night that a group of us went out, we only found one place that hadn't already been graffitied. So that was a rather wonderful entry into activism. Back at university doing philosophy, I decided to write a thesis on In Defence of Separatism, an analysis of power, oppression, domination and institutions, and of things peculiar to women's oppression: heterosexuality as an institution, rape as an instance of coercive power, and romantic love as yet another instance of power. And I ended with sections of on strategies on separatism and lesbian feminism. While I was punished by the philosophy department, I won't go into that, this analysis has stood me in good stead for understanding the world. I left Australia in late 1976, went to London, and in a squat heard about matriarchies. So I then took off to Greece, and there became really enamored of the history and mythology of Greece. After I returned, I came back, started to learn modern Greek and then ancient Greek. In that time, I wrote yet another thesis, which was once again frowned upon because I talked about power and how it operates in the Homeric hymns to Aphrodite and Demeter. These might not seem like radical things, but actually I was really pushing the boundaries. In Defence of Separatism was finally fully published in 2019, and half of my other thesis was published in 2018. So it took a long time for things to change. I then spent the next years in a series of short-term jobs teaching Aboriginal students, teaching English to Arabic women, speaking women, working with unemployed youth, and eventually deciding that I wanted to be a writer. I gave myself 3 months to have something published and had my first work of fiction, and then started writing for the ABC, for Julie Copeland's first edition program, which was wonderful to do that, and also in the metropolitan newspapers. Now, the other thing that happened was I became unemployed for a very long time. I think it was 15 months. And that opened up a chance for me. I became the writing, theatre and music coordinator of Women 150 New Moods Festival. This was meant to celebrate 150 years of white occupation, and I tried to work against that as much as possible. Along with others, I organised a 9-day Language of Difference Writers' Week, and Kerry Hume and Audre Lorde were the keynote speakers. And there were whole days on Aboriginal, migrant, working class and lesbian writing, and in between writing workshops, book launches. Writers' festivals these days congratulate themselves on diversity, but they forget to mention that all these decades ago, we radical feminists were already doing it. As the theatre coordinator, I brought Eva Johnson's Ginderella to Melbourne, a play about Aboriginal dispossession in South Australia. And as the music coordinator, the first ever concert of all women's compositions with a woman conductor was held at the Melbourne Town Hall. So after that, I was exhausted and I took off to Greece again and via Moscow for 3 months. This time I was able to get by a little with my Greek, sitting at bus stops, mostly speaking ancient Greek to old women. I had a fabulous time spending a long time in Crete, but also getting to see Santorini. But again, you know, these were things that I was doing and then going off and turning it into other things later. A whole lot of things I now do would not have been possible without these crazy things. On my return, I got a job at Deakin University teaching Aboriginal students who were training to be teachers. Now, wonderfully, I met Renate Klein at the end of that year because she was also teaching. She had just arrived at Deakin. I had been applying for editing jobs throughout that year, and at the end, I landed a job as editor at Penguin. Here I was able to, as Valerie Solanas says, unwork the system. I tried hard to get books published by Aboriginal writers, by migrants and lesbians, and anybody I thought was subverting the system. One of the things that I did during that time is I managed to persuade Penguin and then later Random House to distribute the Feminist Book Fortnight Favourites catalogue. That was called the FBF, and it was a 2-week national festival for writers and readers, which we said from Burnie to Broome, which 4 of us ran in 1989 and in 91. And those involved were Julie Goff, Jocelynne, Scutt, Renata and me. And in each year we employed an organiser with funding from various state bodies. So if you can use state money to do radical feminist things, it's great. I stayed at Penguin for 4 years and worked with some fabulous writers like Dale Spender, Andrea Goldsmith, Finola Moorhead, Ruby Langford, and many, many more. In the summer of 91, Renata and I had a holiday at Kakadu, and there we talked about setting up Spinifex. We'd spent 1990 in the US, where Renata had a position as a distinguished visiting professor at San Diego State University teaching women's studies, and so Spinifex came into being. In 1994, another group of us put on the 6th International Feminist Book Fair, which we had to make a bid for in 1992. It was a huge undertaking, but in the end, a great success, with around 350 writers from literally all around the world, from China and Saudi Arabia and the US and Canada and New Zealand and everywhere, Germany, and about 100 publishers, also coming from places like Namibia and Egypt. So Spinifex Press has now been running for 31 years, and really it's my main form of activism these days. We've published around 300 books, and if you count the over 40 anthologies, thousands of writers. We've published writers from every continent, and we intentionally publish Indigenous writers, writers with a disability, working class writers, bilingual books, and much, much more. We're probably the publisher with the most lesbians in our list, but in fact, heterosexual women still outnumber lesbians. We're also one of the very few publishers with a strong list of books critical of transgenderism. So I'm just going to mention what they are so that you know. The End of Patriarchy by Robert Jensen, Transgender Body Politics by Heather Brunskill Evans, my book Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, Detransition, Beyond, Before and After by Max Robinson, Doublethink, the Feminist Challenge to Transgenderism by Janice Raymond. Later this year, we have Penile Imperialism by Sheila Jeffries, On the Meaning of Sex by Kaiser Eckes Ekman, and Out of the Fog by Renée Gerlich. The anthology Not Dead Yet, which Renata and I edited last year, includes many essays critical of the trans ideology. We did not suggest that writers write on that, but a vast number of them did. It's a book by women who are over 70 years of age and is intended to break barriers between the feminist generations. It's a real joy to put work out there in so many important areas. For example, this month we're publishing Africa's Eden by Cheryl Adam, which will be launched as part of a trilogy spanning the 1940s to the late 1960s, and will be launched by Andrea Goldsmith on the 6th of April. And next month we publish Rose Hunter's Body Shell Girl, a memoir in a series of poems about getting into and out of the sex industry. It is powerful writing, and I could talk for hours about our books. I will also just mention that Zelda Deprano's book, Zelda, we republished in 1995, and this year sometime, Dan Andrews announced that there's going to be a statue of Zelda. I was also a member of two circuses in Melbourne, the Women's Circus and the Performing Older Women's Circus, which had to be over 40 to join. I became an aerialist, probably thanks to a childhood of climbing trees, hanging from the bars in the wool shed and the wheat bins. I'd always loved gymnastics, but was really only about a medium level. But it gave me the chance of doing solo shows where I later started to combine poetry and aerials. And I did a show at the Gay Games and at Byron Bay Writers Festival in 2002. In 1993, Renata and I travelled to Bangladesh for a conference organised by Farida Akhtar on people's perspectives on population. There were 65 women at the conference, and there I was in a group which was led by Maria Mies. I wrote a 3-page manifesto after 5 days with the conference, which Maria and Jenna Correa said I should turn into a book. And so I became interested in economics, globalization, and many other things I'd never been interested in before, including things like free trade agreements. It eventually turned into my PhD, Wild Politics, Feminism, Globalization, and Biodiversity in Women's Studies and Political Science. So it was quite something to do that after being pushed out by academia. But by now I was not particularly keen to be in academia, although I have now taught creative writing for about 20 years. I really love learning languages, though English remains the only language I speak fluently. I studied ancient Greek, Sanskrit, Latin, Walpurgis, French, German, and Italian. My German is mostly kept up by going to the Frankfurt Book Fair, but I haven't gone for the last 2 years, so it's fallen down. So the other constant is writing, and I have to say that Renée is my first and harshest critic, whether it's poetry, fiction, or non-fiction. She can get away with saying things like, "It's a bit boring," which makes me rethink the structure, as I did with my poetry collection, Looper and Lamb. But I've also had overseas residencies where I wrote several of my books, and I began writing Vortex in Turkey. They've been great experiences. And when I think about it, actually, there's a lot of travel in my writing, and it comes out in books. So, and occasionally we head off and go camping so that we can get away from the connection, the forever connection. And it really is the best thing to do. The other thing that keeps me sane is dogs. And I think many feminists, many of us on this panel have dogs and cats in our lives. And of course, her major job is to remind me when it's time for a walk or when it's dinner time. And of course, I can't underestimate the powerful impact that Renée Klein has had on my life. We've lived together, worked together, laughed together, cried together, especially when our dogs have died. And all these experiences expand out into something profound to do with lesbian existence, to fighting for women to be themselves, to create the world in a different way. So looking back, in 1973, there was so much I didn't know about violence against women, about history and the history and culture of women, about rape and consciousness raising. But we simply jumped in and began doing things, even when we had no idea. So the laws on rape, for example, rape in marriage, would not change until 1982 in New South Wales, followed by changes in other states between 1985 and 92. If we had not had rape crisis centres and activism against rape, including Anzac Day marches against women raped in war, could any of this have changed? Laws on violence against women in the home are moving at a glacial pace, but how much more slowly would it have moved without feminists, especially radical feminists? That these were key issues for women is shown in me writing specifically about both issues in 1976 in Defence of Separatism. I could also not have worked in publishing if I hadn't first been unemployed and then working to organise festivals of women's writing. You never really know how what you do will expand out and take you into new directions. So jumping in is the critical thing. Transgenderism is a key area of activism where every heart and mind is needed. It will take time, but with persistence, passion, and a clear head, I'm sure we'll be able to change things. The Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights is a fantastic document, perhaps the first radical feminist declaration since 1989, when Finrage produced the Camilla Declaration. And the Women's Declaration International's regular presentations and discussions are inspiring, of which this is one. And I'm spurred on by so many amazing radical feminist online sources, articles, Zooms, real life conferences, protests and activism. And I think it's There's more going on now than there has been for a long time. On the downside, it's incredible that the Australian Human Rights Commission can take seriously a complaint by a man about not being able to get onto the female-only app Giggle, to the extent that founder Sal Grover is being pushed into taking it to the High Court. But when a man wanted to join the women's circus back in 2000, it was also taken seriously and divided the circus and destroyed much of the goodwill. I write about this in Vortex. Radical feminism has enriched my life enormously. Indeed, I think it saved my life. Deciding to be a lesbian is also the best decision I ever made. I'm not sure where my life would have headed without both those movements coming along when they did. Thank you very much.
Now we're going to look to the future. And over to you, Renée. Welcome.
In short, I have decided to go out on a limb, or maybe I've been put on one by being asked to speak about the future. I've also decided that going out on a limb is kind of the only thing that's really worth my while at this point in history, for reasons that have been quite thoroughly laid out in the previous presentations. And thank you, Janet, as well, for inviting me, knowing I probably would go out on a limb. And also for everyone here for listening and bearing with me as I do explore some sensitive and potentially uncomfortable terrain. I hope that what I have to say is heard as a contribution and in no way as a contradiction. I'm going to talk about, or perhaps talk within, the tension between feminism and spirituality. And that's because Janet asked me to select an article from the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights to talk about, and to do so with a future orientation. So I chose Article 8, which is about the elimination of violence against women. And if I add the future orientation and put this in somewhat plainer language, it means that I'm talking about the feminist vision of a world without rape. And if I put that in positive terms, the vision of a world without rape becomes that of a world restored to love. To me, it's impossible to avoid the fact that I'm talking about a spiritual revolution. Some feminists may bristle at this, understandably. In this day and age, we have become insistent on talking about the world in terms of hard facts, observable realities, and material conditions. And love and spirituality are not only not material, they're also so often used to manipulate women and deny reality that the very words often make us roll our eyes with exasperation. Perhaps our insistence on talking about the material is in part a reaction to all the emotional and spiritual gaslighting that we experience in the world. Actually, I would take out the perhaps. So in spite of this, I still find my conclusion unavoidable. I simply don't believe that what drives feminists ultimately can be reduced to matters of data and evidence and safety and wealth redistribution and even rights. To delve into this, I want to start by explaining what I mean by the word love. I'm not going to define it with any pronouncements, just with a simple story, which I think is ultimately the only way we really can define what we mean by the word love. So last Christmas, I was at home with my parents, and our dog found a little thrush, a fledgling, that had fallen out of its nest and was panting all by itself. And my father brought the bird to me and said that I needed to look after it, which I thought was very sweet. I don't remember what I was doing, but I stopped and decided to just give the bird all my attention until it didn't need me anymore. So I did the whole bit with the shoebox and the little pipette of water and the mashed Weet-Bix. and so forth. And then I watched for when the bird needed rest and put her in the shoebox. And when she was reviving or restless and wanted to come out, she sat on my shoulder eventually by dinner time when I was cooking. And we had some flying practice when I sat on the floor with my hands near the ground and let her hop from one hand to the other. At night, she slept next to me and I woke up regularly to check on her, but not at the crucial moment. The witching hour, when the sky is darkest and the air coldest and sleep either eludes us or is very deep. I woke up at about 5 a.m. to see that the little bird was lying on her side because she hadn't made it. And it stung. This story may seem childish, but if it does, I think it's because in adulthood, we simply make ourselves less emotionally available to experiences like this for the sake of sensible self-preservation. I just happened to make myself available and felt it. I wanted the little bird to live. Also, I felt responsible, not for her mortality or her vulnerability, but for being asleep precisely when she most needed help, to give her a chance. In that moment, I felt the pain of allowing harm to come to something precious. And in that moment, realized that I do not think the human heart can ever find it gratifying to hurt something. I saw how antithetical it was to human nature to will harm on another creature. And I realized that I don't believe that anybody does this. In other words, I don't believe nature is the enemy of those who oppose violence. Rather, if somebody causes pain to another person on purpose, it is because of what this achieves inside of the nightmare they are mentally suspended in, not because it can actually bring them joy and truth. People who cause harm on purpose are trapped in something like a virtual video game in which their avatar gains points for cruelty. But this video game is not to be confused with the truth. In reality, there isn't actually any satisfaction in causing harm. Most of us evade responsibility for our part of the world's pain, precisely because it hurts us so much to see it. There was a second thing this little bird taught me that came with her friend's morning chorus. As soon as the birds began singing with first light, I heard how improbable the sound was, how each song came out of a being who had once been so fragile, vulnerable, and tiny as to be implausible. I, with my supposed human superiority, could not keep one bird alive through one night. But outside, these tiny birds are nurtured and nourished into strength by their mothers and a whole network of trees and soil and worms and insects, so that they grow wings that can flap and glide, and they can perch and puff their chests and declare with their melodies that existence is possible because life nurtures life. I could hear the miracle that they fill the morning air with this song. Some people call this thing that the birds sing about love, or God, or the Great Mother. They also say that this love is the only truth, and transformation her primary characteristic. One baby bird can be born and mature and pass away, but life continues to nurture life. This singular absolute, the only truth, is what love is. If the people who say this are correct, it's a big deal for feminists, because it means the world we want really does already exist in the here and now, and it is not reducible to facts. I believe, as the spiritual teachers say, that love is our nature. We emerge from it without asking, We cannot extract ourselves from it, even if we want to. There is no exit. We are woven into this tapestry of life. That is what is meant by love being unconditional. It holds us within it, regardless. When I was first reflecting on the theme of my talk, the vision of a world without rape, I thought about how a collective future goal has to come from somewhere. It is not a coincidence that so many women long for a world without rape. Some of us explicitly, some of us in frustration and anger or despair or resentment for how the world really is, others with deep longing or passionate enthusiasm. Some of us carry this vision implicitly without knowing it, like a weight that makes going through the motions of daily life difficult. We experience what Betty Friedan called the problem with no name. The discovery of feminism is a relief for women who carry this unarticulated longing, precisely because it allows us to see that there is real substance to it, and that the substance is a vision, and that the vision indeed justifies all of the whispering and nagging and knocking with which our emotions call our attention. So what is this force that does this knocking? Because that is the source of our collective goal. What is the force that calls women like this, that doesn't let us off the hook, even when we tell it to go away because we need to make dinner and have work tomorrow and obligations to attend to and ordinary life to live? I think the source is our nature. The vision of a world without rape does not come from us, but through us, from love. Our longing for a world without rape is not a fantasy that some women invented, that a bunch of others decided to go along with. It is not a vision we share by coincidence. It is not that I have a dream of living in a house shaped like a cupcake, and I've been lucky enough to find enough women who share this dream to make it seem plausible. Feminism is not that kind of miracle. The cupcake house is an imaginary fantasy, and its realization would be based on the coincidence of determined and like minds meeting. The feminist vision of a world without rape comes from the heart, not the imagination or the intellect. We do not invent it, we only speak it. It is love's vision, and it is love that knocks on the door of women's hearts to show it to us. And love is not asking us to turn a fantasy we invented into a reality that we construct. In other words, it exists now. So this is where I get to the hard bit, because this is why rape hurts in a way that goes beyond other forms of physical assault. Rape is an attempt not only to injure our physical bodies, but to deny the truth that life nurtures life, and that each of us are here to love the world. Feminists identify rape as the cause of human suffering. Rape does not only shape sexual relations because it ties the act of violation to the sex response. Rape sustains the whole human cycle of violence and domination. By associating violation with orgasm and sexual gratification, it allows violence and domination to be fetishized, addictive, and seen as exhilarating, sexy, and macho. This is a big part of the reason that prostitution and pornography are an integral part of the war machine. Porn seduces men to violate against their nature. Feminists see that for domination, cruelty, terror, machismo, and militarism to end, rape must end. Spiritual teachers locate the cause of human suffering elsewhere, in the mind, ego, attachments, identifications, and compulsive thinking. These take us out of the present moment and into a man-made nightmare of separation. But while these two paradigms often appear at odds, they are not. Rape is just the primary tool to make us forget our nature and pull us into the nightmare. A rapist inflicts terror. When women are confronted by rape, our nervous systems protect us by withholding conscious experience of the event and storing that experience in the subconscious. Meanwhile, the woman experiences herself often as drifting or floating away from her body. Sometimes she sees herself as if from above looking down. This is called dissociation. In this moment, there may be two people in the room, but one of them appears to have made himself more than half the equation by compelling the other to leave her body to make room for him. As he makes his intention clear, terror leads the victim to become dissociated from herself as her safety becomes bound up with his emotional state. This creates a kind of false identification of interest. Both people are invested in his emotional state. He wants something and she needs him placated. When he is calm, she can be safe. He has cornered her. Terror has split her heart from her mind. This is what we mean when we say that rape is about dominance, about control. In a rape culture, women who have experienced dissociation never get the message that it is safe to recover conscious experience of the here and now. That is because the culture appears to be one in which men dominate women collectively, just as they do individually in a rape scenario. As Andrea Dawkin wrote, in this male supremacist society, men are defined as aggressive, dominant, powerful. Women are defined as passive, submissive, powerless. Rape occurs when a man who is dominant by definition takes a woman who, according to men and all the organs of their culture, was put on this earth for his use and gratification. Rape, then, is a logical consequence of a system of definitions of what is normative. End quote. Gender, being an institutional expression of the rape dynamic, turns the phenomenon of dissociation that rape establishes into a social and cultural reality. The world appears to belong to the rapist, who owns women. Women feel disconnected from our bodies, ourselves, other women, belonging, and love. We want to make men content. When they are happy, we feel more at ease, safer. The culture calls this kindness, selflessness, and love. Dawkin knew that gender is a lie. Feminists know that gender is a lie, a false story about male dominance and female submission, and a false story about what love is, and what selflessness is, and what freedom is. We see that gender is a reality at the same time as it is not a truth. It is a man-made nightmare that breeds separation. Rape is gender in action, a lie in action. Like gender, it is a reality, but not a truth. The pain of it is the pain of experiencing a lie in action, the nightmare of separation that rape is designed to lure us into. Men are not gods. They do not have the power to change what is true, to sever the ties between women and our bodies, women and earth. They do not have the power either to destroy love, nor the capacity to disconnect us from it. Rape does not actually destroy love or change its nature, or separate women from the tapestry nature weaves that the birds sing about. Even death cannot extract us from that vast and intricate network of relationships of nourishment and giving that we owe our existence to. Rape does not actually sever us from the wholeness of life any more than invasive surgery can change our sex or turn us into a different person. It does not isolate us from the truth of love that we are inextricably part of. It cannot do this, but it does appear to. There is perhaps no lie more convincing, more persuasive than the lie of rape, which tells us the world is cruel and unfeeling, that we are alone in it, and that love is a naive fantasy. Rape is convincing. It does not persuade through logic, but through pain. Pain so severe it appears to undermine the truth that love is why we are here. But the truth remains. The rapist himself will one day go underground to feed the worms who feed the birds. That is what the spiritual teachers call grace. Love does not discriminate. Mother Nature is neither vengeful nor a sadist, and we cannot make her so. Life continues, nature continues, love continues. Plants make oxygen, clouds bring rain, mother birds nurse their babies. If there comes a time when air, water, and food are no longer available to us, it will not be because love ended. It will not be nature's punishment. It seems to me that women of all political, religious, and spiritual persuasions hear the call to return to love in our blood and bones. I believe that more than anything, we are here to answer that call. I believe that doing so is as important as it feels, because women's awakening to our own nature and out of the nightmare is a prerequisite to social transformation, not a hoped-for consequence of it. The purpose of rape is to lure us away from the truth that is love and to sustain the nightmare of separation. If that is the basis of our social problems, which I think it is, then a world restored to love is as much a feminist as a spiritual vision. Yes, the spiritually inclined could afford to listen to women more, rather than use ideas about impermanence and indeterminacy to, very selectively, deny that women exist, that sex exists, that women's heartbreak is anything but imaginary, and that rape is a central problem. At the same time, feminists may take much more sustenance from the spiritual literature and practices that call us than we have allowed ourselves to. Many women leave formal religions and dismiss spiritual ideas as we learn to see how they can be used to promote dissociation and misogyny. As we do this and commit to naming the observable facts of our lives, we can almost come to feel that feminism and spirituality are at odds, that spirituality is blinding and politically irresponsible. Yet social transformation requires women's healing, a return to what is true here and now beyond our man-made reality, the collective nightmare. Even the most distorted religious traditions and New Age ideas can contain wisdom that we sorely need. It is possible to identify the patriarchal distortions and overtones of spiritual and religious teachings, whilst remaining open to the deeper wisdom they can offer. Radical feminists often find ourselves explaining to people what the word radical means, that it comes from a Latin word meaning to go to the root. We call ourselves radical not because of our militancy necessarily, sometimes, or because we are drawn to extremes, but because we don't believe in band-aid solutions to persistent social problems. We want to go to the root and address the problems there. So what does it mean for feminism that the root of our problem in a rape culture is a lie, but not a lie in the form of an intellectual idea we are sold through false reasoning, but in the form of an experience of the world, a disconnection from life that we are brought to through pain and terror? If this is the root of the problem, does this not mean we need to rethink the effort we invest in reasoning with people whose problem is not intellectual? Does it not mean that the ultimate truth we stand for is not material? Does it not mean we need to spend time reflecting on what love is to us, irrespective of what the culture says that it is? And to rethink the emphasis we place on collective action, even at the expense of individual healing. Does the most effective action not come from a healing heart? How can a group of people trapped in a state of dissociation restore the world to love? Is it right to call on traumatized people to act without fear? Must women not restore ourselves to love in order to act fearlessly? Is this not the most important thing? Is this not what Mother Earth herself yearns for, not just outside our window, but through and within us? Is it not true also that it is not us, our limited individual identities, who transform the world? Is it not love that transforms? Do we really hope to transform the world according to our goal through cumulative acts of will? Is it not wiser and more practical to restore ourselves to love, to orient ourselves in that direction, and so allow love to transform the world, since that is what love inexhaustibly does? I realize that my talk will probably prompt more questions and reservations than I have asked here, that it may even appear vague. But I thank you for listening with what Mary Daly called your deep inner ear, not just the material outer ones.